Alright, there we go. So I got the recording started. So we're going to jump back into the text. We got fragment 8 up on the screen where we left off last time. As I was just saying before I started the recording, we tried to get through this previously, but in about 2.5 hours, we got through one line. So it was a great discussion, but I didn't upload that to YouTube if you're listening there. We're going to give it another shot though. We're going to read through the first page of the Phoenix Pre-Socratic's translation of Fragment 8. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to just give some thoughts on each line, what grabs me. Don't have a script, but I've read it so many times, and I was reading it earlier today and thinking about it. So I got a lot to say. This will probably take about an hour and a half, I think. And for those in the room, please feel free to request the mic, put your hand up, however you like. Here we go. A single story of a root still is left, that it is. On this root there are signs very numerous, that what is ungenerated and imperishable, whole, single-limbed, steadfast, and complete. Nor was it once, nor will it be, since it is, now, all together, one, continuous. For what coming to be of it will you seek? In what way, whence, did it grow? Neither from what is not shall I allow you to say or think. For it is not to be said or thought, that it is not. And what need could have impelled it to grow, later or sooner, if it began from nothing? Thus, it must either be completely or not at all. So that's the entirety of the first page of their translation. You can see in the screenshot there's alternative translations if afterwards you want to go back and see some of the other ways that people have handled it. And if anyone wants the Greek, I can provide it. Obviously, this is all coming from Simplicius's commentary on Aristotle's physics. That's where the bulk of these fragments are coming from. Not just for Parmenides, but actually for Melissus, the other famous Eleatic as well. Of course, there's Parmenides, Zeno, Melissus. But Melissus is preserved in large part by this same much later author, Simplicius, who is they would term him a Neoplatonist or a Platonist, but he not only is the main source for these longer Parmenides fragments, although there are other people preserving Parmenides, but he is also, thankfully, someone who preserved Melissus for us. Again, mostly in that commentary on Aristotle's physics, although it is in a few of his other commentaries too. So we've read through the fragment. What I'll do now is I'm just going to go back through it line by line and say what stands out to me. Again, not necessarily off a script, but I've read it today a couple of times, and I've read it so many times in the past, and I find it very valuable. And I think this is, I don't want to say that one fragment is paramount over all other fragments, but this is one, I believe it's the longest fragment, and two, it's a prolonged set of arguments that I believe all stem from one fundamental teaching. And so you have sort of this prolonged, purely philosophical discourse or logical discourse or metaphysical discussion from the goddess here. And I think if we carefully examine the beginning of Fragment 8, we'll see how it all hangs together, or how what the goddess has to say is a necessary inference of this initial point. So rather than listen to me, let's go back over the fragment. Again, it's the same one we just read. A single story of a root still is left, that it is. I'm ending it there at the halfway through the second line approximately. You can see in the screenshot. Because, and this is probably why the last time I tried to do this space, we went 2.5 hours or so with just that, because I think this is one of the most important parts of the poem, and also it's an invitation to almost discuss everything that has previously occurred. So I could spend hours just on this one section here. Because what does the goddess say in Fragment 8? Okay, for context, Fragment 8 is occurring in the section on truth. Having listened to the previous spaces, that's where we're at. and she says, a single story of a root still is left. So what is the goddess referencing here? Like, why is there a single story of a root? How many were there to begin with? And what is the goddess talking about in this context? The goddess has essentially told us, and if we're the youth, she's told us she's going to tell us two sets of things. The initial one is at the end of the proem, and again, I'm trying to do this quickly, but if we go to I got the book in my hand here, so if we go to the end of the proem, what does she say? She says, it is no ill fortune that sent you forth to travel this route, for it lies far indeed from the beaten track of men. Again, this is a proem, so this is where the youth has been brought forward by the maidens and allowed in by the goddess, by justice, to see the goddess in this place beyond night and day. So that's one route, but that's not the one that we're talking about in Fragment 8, but I'm just going over it. So that's one route. It's the one that the youth has taken to meet the goddess. Far indeed from the beaten track of men. But right and justice for him to be there. It is right that you should learn all things, both the steadfast heart of persuasive truth. The word persuasive there can also be well-rounded. There's some differences in the manuscripts or our reception of the fragment. But it could be steadfast heart of persuasive truth, or steadfast heart of well-rounded truth, or circular truth. And the beliefs of mortal, in which there is no true trust. But nevertheless you shall learn these things as well, how the things which seem had to have genuine existence, permeating all things completely. So I go back here because this is the proem, and this is where the goddess mentions two things, and she talks about a root that she's going to present the youth. Fragment 8 begins with, a single story of a root still is left. But it's not this one. I don't think so. But essentially, those first two roots at the beginning of the proem is going to be steadfast heart of truth, or what is. And then how the beliefs of mortals, in which there is no true trust, had to have genuine existence. So how there is A, the steadfast heart of persuasive truth, and B, all the things that seem, or that, what mortals discuss, night and day and all these other opposites, and hot and cold and whatnot, there has to be some genuine existence. They have to have genuine existence, which I take as meaning they have to be either subsumed by, or somehow within, or somehow connected to that steadfast heart of persuasive truth. So we have one root, but it consists of two topics there. But the other place where the goddess discusses a root is, we go to Fragment 2, I believe. Yeah, Fragment 2, which is where we begin the section on truth, or aletheia. So that is, I suppose, what we're going to tie to her promise of steadfast heart of where was it? Steadfast heart of persuasive truth, rather than discussing the mortal opinions. So we're not at the mortal opinions yet, but this section on truth is going to be about that root, I think, the steadfast heart of persuasive truth. And then inside that, now we have two roots again. So the goddess came forward, said, you've traveled this route to me, it's off the beaten track, but it's good that you're here. I'm going to teach you the truth, and how all the opinions have to have genuine existence. They have to be found somewhere in the truth, in my interpretation. Then she's going to say, let's discuss the truth. For how does this Fragment 2 begin? Come, I shall tell you, and do you listen and convey the story, what roots of inquiry alone there are for thinking. So we're in the section on truth now, and she's going to discuss that steadfast heart of persuasive truth, that root, I guess. But now there's internally going to be two roots that she mentions. The one, that it is, and that it cannot not be, is the path of persuasion, for it attends upon truth. The other, that it is not, and that it needs must not be. Okay, so we have two roots there. Now, in my interpretation, and I think explicitly stated in the text here, that second root, that it is not, and that it needs must not be, has been knocked out. I mean, what's the next line after introducing the second root? That I point out to you to be a path wholly unlearnable, for you could not know what is not, for that is not feasible, nor could you point it out. And again, what do we see? Here we go. Let's go a little further into the text. because she does this a few times. Fragment 6. It must be that what is there for speaking and thinking of is. Again, that's the is of the... I'm relating that to that first route. The one that it is and that it cannot not be. For it is there to be, whereas nothing is not. That is what I bid you consider. So again, the second path is that nothing is not. There's nothing there for speaking and thinking of. So again, knocking out the second path. Again, fragment 7. For this shall never prevail, that the things that are not are. But do you restrain your thought from this route of inquiry, nor let habit force you, along this route of much experience, to ply an aimless eye and ringing ear and tongue, but judge by reasoning the very contentious disproof that has been uttered by me. So you can see prior to fragment 8, at least in this ordering, that's why a single story of a root still is left. It's not that she knocked out the teachings that she mentioned in the proem, namely steadfast heart of persuasive truth, and how the opinions had to have genuine existence, but rather she's referencing the second set of roots that are within the truth, is and is not. And she's knocked out the is not. What I have heard people say is, why does the goddess put forward two roots if there's only one? Like, how can you name the second root? Because how does she do it in the beginning of fragment 2? She says, the one that it is and that it cannot not be is the path of persuasion, for it attends upon truth. The other, that it is not and that it needs must not be, that I point out to you to be a path wholly unlearnable, for you could not know what is not, for that is not feasible, nor could you point it out. So if the goddess is immediately going to follow up and say, you can't learn about it, you can't point it out, and then in two following fragments, I think 7 and 4 maybe? Yeah, 4. Oh, no. What do we have here? 6 is definitely one. Oh yeah, 6 and 7. How is she naming two paths if she's saying that you can't name them or can't point them or can't think of them? Why would the goddess do that if my interpretation is correct and there's only one path? And indeed, fragment 8 begins. A single story of a root still is left. Why name two if only one is left? And in my interpretation or my understanding of the text, I take it from a literary perspective and also from an exhaustive way of making a very crucial and core point about Eleatic philosophy. So in terms of the literary position, what's happening here? We saw at the end of the poem, the youth is taken down, the goddess sits him down and says, I'm going to teach you the truth and how mortal opinions have genuine existence. And then she's talking to a youth who has just come from the mortal realm. He's one of those mortals. And what does the goddess have to say about mortals? Well, I'm not going to flick through this book as quickly as I should, so I'll just say off the top of my head. She calls them double-headed. She says that I think it's at the end of fragment 8 actually, where she says they name two when they should say one. So she's talking to someone at this point in the poem, fragment 2, the beginning of the section on truth. She's talking to someone who names two when they should name one. They think there's two, or they come up with two forms or two ways of speaking about what is really one thing. Or unified, it's one. So her language doesn't necessarily have to be a positive endorsement of there being two paths in terms of the overall existential status of reality. In my interpretation, the goddess clearly believes there just is what is. There just is, isness or being. But she names two forms because she's talking to a double-headed mortal who names two when there should be one. And after adopting the language of the person that she's speaking to, who she's going to enlighten, because again, she says to him, do you listen and convey the story? And later on, she also tells him at the end of, it's fragment 9, yeah. No, it's the end of fragment 8 as well. She tells him that she's also teaching him so he can out-argue the other mortals when he goes home. She's adopted his language because this is how mortals speak of is and is not. We're double-headed. We name two instead of one. And so she's like, okay, sit down, listen to me, convey the story afterwards. Let's see how we can talk about what is. That it is, and that it cannot not be, or that it is not, and it needs must not be. And then she immediately points out how ridiculous the second path is. It's just a no-go. It's a non-starter. I view her as pointing out a direct contradiction here, which is saying there is not. It's like saying is not is. It's just direct contradiction. And I believe that's what we see at the end of Fragment 2 and in Fragment 6 and 7, which is why we are now here in Fragment 8. A single story of a root still is left, that it is. Because there was only ever one root. And the only reason two were mentioned in Fragment 2 is because of the audience. But also I think the reason we have this mentioned here, and why she names two paths at the beginning, is because if we have an existential monist, like an absolute monistic sense of reality here, where all is one, there just is one thing, there is what is. How do we deal with someone who hasn't grasped that yet, like the youth? Like, how do we express that extent or all-consuming breadth of the term is or being? Like, there's nothing outside of it, nothing that escapes it by definition. How do we capture that meaning, especially to a youth? Because really all of what follows in Fragment 8 and elsewhere, I would argue, follows from this core teaching that there is what is, there just is. And now knowing that all we can speak about is what is, all these things follow. For example, we'll see it in the fragment, she goes and does this. But this core point about an all-subsuming, like the greatest breadth of something, that it is, that needs to be made. And so one way of making it is actually to say, the one, that it is and that it cannot not be. And then the other, that it is not and it needs must not be, and point out the contradiction of the second one. Because when you point out the contradiction and you say there's no meaning, this is meaningless, you can't learn it, you can't point it, you can't think it, the words just break down into meaninglessness when you say that there is that which is not. It's like a direct contradiction. You pose it as the two, not only because that's how your audience, the youth or the mortals, speak, but also because if you knock out one, you're left with the one. Again, a single story of a root still is left. And that's the only root that is left. And if an Eleatic philosopher, or any philosopher, like why restricted to Eleatics? If a philosopher can establish that there is just one, like reality is all unified and all 100% contained in this one context, then all these necessary inferences follow. So by positing two to entertain your audience and then knocking out the second one, that's also a kind of philosophical way of proving, hey, look, now there's just one. It's sort of that definitional point of, how are we defining is in my interpretation? It's just is all affirmative existence or meaning or anything that can be pointed at or learnt or all the other terms the goddess uses. And now, by definition, that would consume everything. And so if you pointed somewhere else to a second path, you would have contradicted yourself because it should have been on the first path because it's being pointed at. So I interpret that as how we've come here to the beginning of Fragment 8. A single story of a root still is left, that it is. Whether or not we agree with that conclusion, I think that's how we got here. And I will also mention, look how she's worded it in the beginning of Fragment 8 as opposed to Fragment 2. It says, a single story of a root still is left, that it is. Again, existential interpretation here. It just, reality is. It's not an is not. It's everything that is. In the beginning of Fragment 2, she wrote, what roots of inquiry alone are there for thinking? The one, that it is, and that it cannot not be. It's two clauses here. And, I understand, like in Fragment 8, it's only one clause, that it is. In Fragment 2, it's that it is, and that it cannot not be. I think that it cannot not be, if interpreted in Fragment 8, where we're giving an extended argument about what follows from reality simply being what is, then it cannot not be is just one of the necessary inferences. It's not actually the first path. The first path is just that it is, and then everything follows from that. And that's why in Fragment 8, where we actually get arguments about the nature of what is, she just cuts it there. That would be my reasoning on why it's only presented as a single clause rather than two. Whereas in Fragment 2, the goddess isn't really, the goddess is not arguing about the nature of the first path, right? She's presenting these two paths, just like mortals would expect, is and is not. And I think the reason why she couples it with that second clause, that it cannot not be, and then for the second path, that it needs must not be. I think because she wants the two paths to be perceived or discussed or held in their own right. Like the one path, we're talking about what is, not as something that could become what is not, or something that could become something else. We're just talking about it as what is. Therefore we say, here's the one path that it is, and then it's got nothing to do with anything beyond that. It cannot not be. It cannot become something else. We're just talking about it in its own right. And then the second path, of course, is we'll talk about what is not. Or we'll talk about nothing. And that it needs must not be. And we talk about it in its capacity as what is not, or as a nothing. So I think that's why there's a second clause there. Again, that's my interpretation, but I can see why the second clause would be here, because you're emphasizing that the two paths are being taken in their own right. And when you do that, there's no recourse to preserve the second path, because they can't tie the second path back to the first path, or say it has some sort of quasi-being or something, because it's like, no, we're talking about what is not, and needs must not be, like in that sense of not being anything, not being a quasi thing. So I think that's why we get two clauses there. That's my current way of thinking about it. But it is interesting that when we get to Fragment 8, the second clause is not there in that opening line of a single story of a root still is left, that it is. But it can still be talked about as cannot not be, but in the context of Fragment 8, it's going to be in all these arguments that follow as a necessary inference of there only being one thing. Because you'll see when we go through this, and I read it from start to finish this page earlier in the space, but we're going to see even here in the rest of this page that there are some huge ramifications for there only being one thing. So yeah, there you go. That's how I read the first sentence and a half, or line and a half of that fragment. I think it's an open invitation to really discuss everything that has occurred previously, and I could just keep on going forever about it. But I do just want to emphasize that that sort of path of how we came to it being one root, because I believe the goddess is ultimately saying there's just one thing that it is. And really that's the core Eleatic teaching, that there is this grand totality, or universally unified, all-consuming sense of is. And that's going to lead to all these subsequent arguments or necessary inferences that follow. And the rest of that line, so we got a single story of a root still is left, that it is. On this root, there are signs very numerous. If you do have the Phoenix pre-Socratic copy, the intro does point this out. The word signs here is the same word as you'll find later in the fragments for stars. It's semat. I don't know Greek, obviously, but it's the same word that comes later in the text for when he discusses the stars. And so the introduction author, David Gallup, he mentions, it's sort of like people find their way by the stars looking up from a boat, right? And so here we are looking up at the inferences that follow from the path of that it is. I added a lot of words to what David Gallup actually said in the introduction. I didn't flick back to that section of the intro, but I do thank him for pointing out to me that the word stars appears later in the fragments as well, and is kind of serving the role of being a waypoint or a sign of where to go. And notice as well, like when we started this going through the fragments, I mentioned that I always have an interest in any sort of plurality, right? Because I want this Parmenides this being, to be a Parmenides of meaning. I want it to capture all that is. I want to preserve that second promise from the goddess, going back to fragment 1. Nevertheless, you shall learn these things as well, how the things which seem had to have genuine existence, permeating all things completely. So I want to preserve that multiplicity of meaning, or that complexity of meaning, or just everything that we're aware of. I realize that we have to fit it into the context of one thing, is, or being, because that's the only root left, right? But I don't want to give it up. And so I want to make sure that if someone comes along and gives me a interpretation of Parmenides that denies any sort of detail or meaning, I can bring out some of these multiple details or signs very numerous, which I mean to take as these threads of logic, or these necessary inferences that lead us to all these conclusions about it, about that it is, and what the nature is of what is. Because it's not enough just to say there's a single root, that it is. We should also follow these signs very numerous and come to understand more about its nature. And it's critical that we understand its nature. Again, this is all there is, just the path of is, affirmative existence. And it's crucial we understand its nature, because whatever we posit, like Twitter, or this cup of tea I have over here, or my microphone, or my phone, or my book, it's in the context of, or it's consumed by, that single root, that it is. And therefore, it's constrained, or it has to fit in that context. It can't contradict isness, because it's just a detail of what is, right? And so if we can follow these signs very numerous, we'll understand more about the nature of being, or that it is, that single root. And in knowing more about being, or that single root that it is, we're going to understand how everything must be. And it's not immediately obvious what practical impact that'll have on us, but as we go through these arguments in Fragment 8, again, it's a wonderful fragment. It's long, and it goes through many of what I believe to be the necessary inferences of there being only one path. As we go through it, we're going to hear all these things about its nature, or what it requires of the things that are said of it. And I'm not going to single out any person I disagree with or school I disagree with, but many times there are things that we are told about the nature of life, or morality, or things like that. And some of the claims about maybe someone gets eternally damned or something like that are not going to be compatible, at least at first glance, with the nature of that single root, which is going to be argued out in this fragment. And so if a religious claim, or a philosophical claim, or some physical claim, like, oh, you get blown up, you're destroyed, you don't exist, like if those claims don't comply with the signs very numerous of what the nature of this root is, then there's no true claim at all. Just like the goddess said that the second root is no true path at all, so their claims are no true claims at all. There's a contradiction in there, and their meaning breaks down somewhere, and it's no longer they've offered you some meaning that you should believe or obey. There's actually a contradiction or error inherent in there that you should instead be looking to discover. Like, how and why did they fail to, go as far as they thought they went? So if someone says, if a car is blown up, it no longer exists. And you can say, whoa, wait a minute. Everything we have to say is on that single root, that it is. How do you mean it doesn't exist? Because you can't oppose something to an existential is, because everything is. You must mean something else. And so when you have this broader metaphysical teaching, even though the practical ramifications are not immediately obvious, I think going through Fragment 8 is going to lead us to a whole bunch of necessary conclusions about religion and physics and many things. So I think there's actually a great value in this metaphysical prolonged set of arguments where we review the signs very numerous of the nature of that single story of a root that's left, is. So we have managed to get to 2.5 lines. But let's keep going. If anyone wants to comment or anything, just put your hand up. I'll give you the mic. I'll let you make your own comments or input on what the fragment may mean, or you can ask questions or tell me I'm wrong. It's all good. But as I said at the beginning of this space, I'm trying to get through this page and get it up on YouTube. Oops, here we go. Ancient, you have the mic. Feel free to talk at any time. Did you have anything to add now, or did you just want to pop in later?
Yeah, well, the thing you just said is interesting. That wasn't the main thing I wanted to talk about, but I think the problem, to put it as a problem for your perspective, is that you have, and this isn't to say it's wrong, although of course I believe that, but when you say that something exploded no longer exists, and you stubbornly persist on that, I think the weakness in your view is that you don't grant that there is identity to certain constitutions of matter or certain structures, such that at one point there was a car and now there is no car any longer. And I don't know if it's because you think of what is as this radically totalizing monism, such that the identity of the car is just subsumed into the whole, or if it's something else. But in terms of a drawback, it seems like there's something quite a drawback for any system that does not acknowledge that there are these identities of beings that are separate from being as a whole.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you. The and no worries that you think I'm wrong. That's perfectly fine. I've had many people tell me I'm wrong. There's 2 points I would say there. The you said at the end there that there was a failure to, I forget your exact wording. The last line you said was something like a failure to recognize the identity of things as opposed to the whole. And I think if we're discussing cars and explosions and the like, I'm already there. I admit that whatever that being has this complex meaning or all these details. Now, of course, I assume that all these details and everything we have to say in ourselves as well apply to being. And because being is, of course, ungenerated, imperishable, and all the other things we'll hear, they're all just as immortal as being is immortal, right? So the reason why I suppose I would be like unwilling to accept someone who told me that the car is destroyed is more a matter, like if we're being very strict, it's more a matter of why did we just end the sentence at the car is destroyed? I think we can talk of destruction of the car, like it blowing up, but we can't just we can never end a sentence by saying that something is not. We have to admit that it is, but then draw some distinction to another thing that is. So, for example, it's the car is destroyed. Well, okay, the car is not present today because it was blown up this morning, but it's still present yesterday. Like nothing happened to yesterday. It's still there, inviolate. There's no reason, in my mind, I mean, other people argue otherwise if they have a presentist view of time, but if everything is, if all meaning is and is ungenerated and imperishable, then the entire timeline, I believe, has to be ungenerated and imperishable. And I'm borrowing that language, of course, from the third line of Fragment 8, but it's also repeated throughout this page. But I just, go on.
But what warrants you to distinguish these parts of the timeline? I mean, if you're going to be a consistent monist, I don't know where you're getting the warrant to distinguish these different aspects of the timeline, nor do I even know why you have recourse to saying that this, whatever it is a car here and something else isn't?
Well, I have the recourse because of direct experience, right? I am in being. Like, I am part of this one thing. I would analogize being to just a very large object, like a painting, and all the details are subsumed by the painting, is wholly contained in the painting. So I don't go in for the idea that monism. I mean, there's many types of monism, and other people would argue it differently than I would. But when the goddess said that the way of seeming, like the things that seem, or our opinions, must have genuine existence, but yet reality is on that single root, just what is, then I'm kind of left thinking that reality is kind of like this complete picture, like this perfect painting that has all the meaning. And so, and I'm in there, and I have direct, like, I have the seeming, right? I have the direct experience. And so I can't deny either one. I can't deny that there's one root left, that it is. And simultaneously, I can't deny that I was driving a car. All I can do, I think, is be circumspect in describing what it is I experience, like driving a car, not making sure that I say more than, I don't go off the rails. I'm just very circumspect in my understanding of what my experience is. And then try to describe it in a way that does not contradict that it's all affirmative content. And so, I don't personally, now maybe there's some devastating reason and I've missed why I shouldn't talk of a multiplicity, but I just view the philosophical project as understanding that the broad context is that it is, and now all the stuff we encounter, ourself, everything we are, our nature, it all has to fit in that context somehow. And I wind up analogizing reality to this perfect picture that subsumes all meaning. And when I describe reality, it's like describing this perfect picture. I'm like saying, look, on the left side of the painting is a tree, on the right side is my car. 5 minutes later in the painting is an explosion and my car's gone. But it's all there in the whole. And what I am is just that set of experiences. Now, you probably have many criticisms of that, and maybe valid ones, I don't know. But that's my thinking on it. I can at least offer you that.
Yeah, I wonder, do you think there's somewhere here where Parmenides can be taken as arguing or just stating that being is homogeneous for all that is in some way, meaning that there is something being that all these things we say are, or are these just an accumulation of different parts and things together, and we give them this name being? Or is there something that penetrates and draws them all together that we call being? That for lack of a better word, we could refer to as some kind of homogeneous property.
Yeah, there's secondary literature on this. I've read like essays on it. It is an issue that comes up on how to understand things like we see on this page actually single-limbed. I mean, that's not homogeneous. That's what let me see on the Greek here. It looks like a monomeles. But the this discussion of homogeneity does come up. There's another term that's Greek that obviously you know Greek far better than me. But there's another term that's homo-oiomeros, right? So it's like the same parthood, I guess. And so, when we say in English homo, like H-O-M-O, then oimeros, like a meros is a part, right? So homo oimeros. And I only bring this up because in these arguments about in what sense should the Eleatics mean that the one is homogeneous, it becomes a question almost of, do we mean it's homogeneous in the homo-oimeros sense where, a drop of water, the ocean is constituted of a whole, I guess it's not, but a whole pile of drops of water. And each drop of water is interchangeable with any other drop of water. Do we mean it in that sense, which is homo-oimeros, where each part is literally identical and interchangeable with any other part. And I don't think the Eleatics mean that. Now, that's my interpretation. There are people who interpret it that they do mean it that way. But they don't use the word homoimeros, but I'm sure there's some history of how that word was developed, and maybe that post dates them. But I would...
Well, it seems like there's a problem either way.
The homogeneous way obviously appeals to me, because then it's like the parts of my body all constitute one thing. And what's unique about being as opposed to my body, I can say that I'm homogeneous, even though I am part of these different organs and body parts and ideas or whatever. However we want to model reality. I'm not claiming to have the right practical model, but we can call me homogeneous, even though I have these mismatched parts that aren't interchangeable. But what's unique about being, and why, again, this start of Fragment 8 is so crucial, and why I think the goddess starts by posing, for argument's sake and for the youth's sake, two roots, is because being is the one. It's the only true one. So there is no second, there's no way of dividing, because that's another core teaching, right? That's one of the necessary inferences, that if there only is what is, it's indivisible and it's inseparable, because there's nothing you could use to, kind of drive a wedge and break it into pieces. It's always going to be unified because it's all there is, and what would separate it, right? So the homogeneity of being is unique.
You're going to say you're going to interpret Parmenides as saying, though, that it's inseparable from non-being, right?
Or inseparable from itself. Like it can't be divvied up. It's not divisible.
In what sense?
Well, because if you divide something, you sort of speak about it as being independent of the other thing now, right? Like to have no connection to it, like to be disconnected from something. But being can't be disconnected from being. That's kind of, there's a few fragments in here where the goddess makes a point that it can't be cut apart, or like it can't stop, like being can't be cut off from being. And the most famous one is probably that bit where she talks about how the mind can reach everything. Hold on, let me see if I can pull that up.
Right, but
here we go, Fragment 4.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and read it.
Fragment 4 is, look upon things which, though far off, are yet firmly present to the mind, for you shall not cut off what is from holding fast to what is, for it neither disperses itself in every way, everywhere, in order, nor gathers itself together. There are a few other parts in the fragments that are about this issue, and Melissus also is about this, and I think it's actually a big point of a Zeno as well. But that's I've talked over you enough. I'll let you speak now.
Well, I think there's a sense in which you could say what he's trying to do there is allow that, or not allow, but press home the point that all being is the same. We don't have a multiplicity of beings, we have one being, and all these different things in some sense have to be aspects of it.
That's essentially
but they're not separated by non-being. There's not gaps of non-being.
Right.
That's one idea.
Right.
And they're all part of this thing. And I think you'd want to say that because you don't want to say something like, and this is what it sounds like you want to say quite often. I don't think you want to say that these things are radically one and they're not distinguished from each other. And the reason I say that is because he seems to have an understanding of truth that is based on misidentification. So one version of truth might be something like, when you say something false, you're saying something that is not, right? And he doesn't seem, obviously he's not going to like that. So what is his version? What is his understanding of truth? It seems to be that the main part of it is that what happens when you say something false is you misidentify one part of being for another part of being. And the mistake is that everything, there's two parts of that mistake. One is to forget that everything is, and the other part is just simply that you're switching parts of things, right? You're mistaking this for that. And in so doing, you may also be foolishly thinking that you're thinking or speaking of non-being, which is impossible. But I think the overall point is that if that's right, and this is the way that Parmenides views how we speak truly or falsely, it presupposes that there are different aspects of being that are dissimilar. So being is homogeneous in one sense and not in another, and that not in another seems to be required for his understanding of truth.
Well, it's homogeneous in the sense that it is all subsumed by what is, right? It all is on that path of what is. But it's not homoemeros, the other form of what I guess also gets caught under the older term homogeneous, in that they're not all interchangeable and not having distinct meaning. Right?
Right.
Right. So I guess this discussion we just had initiated at some point with this discussion of homogeneity. And so that's why I immediately wanted to draw that distinction between the drops of water and that are interchangeable and the fact that things are not interchangeable. Because you're right, I don't think that the details of being are interchangeable. I think they are what they are in their own right, and I am not the computer. And I agree with much of what you were saying about falsity or falsehood. I would, but I don't see. If the only criteria of homogeneity was that it is part of the same thing, it is part of the one, with the proviso that in terming it part, we're not saying that it could be divided off from the one, separated away from it, and have independence of it, but it's just like a distinct detail. It still satisfies that broader idea of homogeneity, where all we have to say is that it is a detail of one thing. Like they all are the same in the sense that they all are of being or of the path that it is. The other sort of falsehood I would mention is where the words, there's grammatical structure to our words and structure or logical structure to our thinking. It's kind of like the shape of what is. And so if we are talking and trying to make some argument and the argument contradicts itself, the most obvious one is the one we see in Fragment 2, where we say that there is that which is not, in the sense that it is not. Then we haven't really said anything, or we haven't really grasped anything. It's kind of like the edge of being almost, or it's like a corner of a table. It's like you don't go beyond that. So there hasn't been as much meaning as we hope to convey, right? So that's another sort of falsehood where someone comes in and says, well, there is that which is not. And it's not identifying something that I would say is wrong. It's just that the speech is almost non-responsive to whatever question or point they were trying to make, because they turned that corner of the table or the edge of the shape, and their words didn't communicate anything beyond that, or their thought didn't grasp anything beyond that. And to the extent they think it did, they're just double-headed and confused, I suppose. So it's not the same sort of falsehood you were mentioning, but I would throw that in the bucket.
Well, yeah, I wonder if he seems to be very adamant on this point that we cannot even think of what is not.
Yeah. So that's the sense that I think he's saying we cannot think there is not. It's that sense of you've kind of run your hand along the side of being, like this is the extent of it, or this is the nature of it, and you don't press through to the other side or anything, because there is no other side against it, So I think that last point I made is what he's saying you can't speak of. You can't speak of the true contradiction, I suppose, that it is not. There is what is not. the meaning just breaks down and there's nothing there to talk of.
Well, to think of nothing is to think something. You're thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
You have an object in mind. And so I don't know if that's the primary thing he has in mind when he says that it's impossible to think that which is not, but it does follow from that. But it seems to me that he might get to that more abstract point, but I think the primary point is that when you think of something that you think is not, what you're actually doing is thinking of something that is and mistaking it for something else that is. And then you come to this wrong conclusion, or you, I don't know if you'd say you come to the wrong conclusion, but that's what error is.
Yeah, there's two things I would say. One is, I fully appreciate the account of error you're giving, and I think we can make that Parmenidean. It probably is what he means in Fragment 2 and elsewhere. It's almost like two tally pieces, and they don't fit together. My only thing that I would add is that both tally pieces exist, right? So, the diplomat's going somewhere, or they make a deal and they break the jade bee or whatever in half, and the two halves are supposed to join together, or whatever they're doing. And when I say, like, oh, the car is blue when it's pink, it's like there's a lack of accord there. But we have to say that all of that story is. So the pink car is, or at least my idea of a pink car is, the black car is, the I am, like, all of it is affirmative content, and we're just kind of discussing their relationship, like, the black car is other than the pink car. But we have to admit that there is a pink car, there is a black car, it's all affirmative meaning. We can never go and make the mistake of assuming a negative meaning, like a literal is not, if that makes sense. But also, I cling to the contradiction point, because obviously for the metaphysical point that I wish to make about the fact that there only is, I need to literally outright eliminate any talk of is not. And so if I can make it sort of the shape of being, or the corner of a table, or a thing that you can't go beyond, then I get that, right? So that's why that is also important to me, and I emphasize that in my reading of the fragments, because I'm obviously looking at establishing that broad sense of is, of which we can't get beyond, and any words that purport to do that are just confused and double-headed and fall apart and don't communicate meaning, because I need to preserve that universal sense of is, because I believe that all of these arguments that follow about ungenerated, imperishable, whole, single-limbed, steadfast, complete, etc., I believe all of that rests on that point about there just being one existential thing being.
Well, one difficulty here is, so this fragment 2 at least, it doesn't seem like it's an argument from an experience. What it seems like is it's an argument it's just a purely conceptual argument, and then he applies it to being. And I think, I can't remember which, I guess it's probably your fragment 3, to think and to be is the same.
That happens in a few spots, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's that fragment 3 is the conclusion to fragment 2, and they should be together. But it doesn't really matter, because we both agree that he said both of those things, so we are free in that sense to combine them. But that fragment 3 even shows it more clearly, that because being and thinking are the same thing, he obviously grants a very tight association between thinking and how the way things are. And so I don't know if this is a kind of probabilistic argument, or an argument about the way that we interact with the world, but do you take it that he is also committed that there never was a beginning of the universe and there will never be an end to the universe?
Right, I read him as being an eternalist. Well, and actually, in the beginning of Fragment 8, on this first page, we see the line which is sort of a redo of what Heraclitus said, but it says, "Nor was it once, nor will it be, since it is now altogether." Combined with the claim that it's ungenerated and imperishable, yeah, I'm going to say that my reading of Parmenides is that time is a complete and perfect now that doesn't change. It doesn't have a beginning where it was not and now comes to be, and it doesn't have an end where it was and then will cease to be. Um, yeah.
So this isn't a particular philosophy that's only available to us mortals because we have a mind that works in this way. This is him talking about how the universe is.
Well, yeah, I think he's following the necessary inferences that if there is only one root, namely this root of affirmation or being, then a certain model of time is going to shake out as well, right? And much of this first page of Fragment 8 is him attacking claims of something being generated or something being destroyed. So I think, yeah.
So you personally, you don't believe that there was a Big Bang?
No, I can believe there's a big...
like that.
Yeah, I can believe in a Big Bang, but it's no more the beginning than today is the beginning, It's a moment. I believe all possible moments exist in this grand array of all possibility. I think that whatever's possible is necessary, and in the fullness of time, everything has occurred. So it's just like this complete timeline. If someone says that a Big Bang happened, it's like, okay, but I don't think the Big Bang created in the sense that they would say it created. That's the part I would disagree with.
Yeah, so on my reading of Parmenides, he doesn't have the tools to articulate non-existence either before the Big Bang or at the end of the universe. But from your perspective, you would just say that would just be privileging certain time periods, which shouldn't be privileged.
Yeah, I think, Fragment 8, I think the goddess goes a little too far in her pursuit of attacking those who talk about creation and destruction. Because, yeah, for me, the question ended when we just had a single story of a root still left, that it is. And the Big Bang is not, it's not that I have to have language to talk about something that is not and now came to be. It's just like I completely cut off that way of thinking. It's like, no, Big Bang is not privileged in some sort of creation or generation sense, because creation or generation, if talked about existentially, is a contradiction. It's illegitimate in my mind. So yeah, it's not privileged. I mean, you could kind of have people like, if we're talking about Parmenides' time, obviously Empedocles is younger, right? But the Empedocles has, in some interpretations, this cycle of love and strife, right? And so I guess the Big Bang could be... I hate to do this in modern physics, which I don't understand well, and an ancient physical system that I'm only kind of comprehending, but love is when everything is brought close together, and strife is when it's at its maximum set of separation or repulsion, right? And so I suppose the Big Bang is when it was at the maximum point of love, namely everything is all together in one single place. And then what is the only possible change from that? Well, it's to become separated, right? And so I guess if you made Empedocles an eternalist with this sort of time model where all possible moments exist together in this great array of time, like a very complicated movie that's all pre-recorded, at one point in the movie, you would have all of the material stuff condensed down in this high point of love into one point. And then, of course, the next moment in the movie would be when it explodes out, because that's the only possible way it could change. And I guess at the other end of the movie, you have it all separated in strife. So I guess there is some vaguely contemporary with Parmenides' way of speaking of an eternalist system where there could be a Big Bang. That's just me cobbling it together, though. But yeah, but for me, I just cut off any talk of an existential generation or a privileging of the Big Bang. I don't think the Big Bang is more real than now, or that there was something that is not before the Big Bang, but I can't talk about it. I just think there's just the Big Bang and all the other moments, and they're all equally existent, and there just is what is.
So you, as a monist, though, you have to be committed to some kind of constant change going on within the universe, right?
Well, so that's really the challenge of philosophy, right? It's to bring in our direct experience and to understand it as in a way that's consistent with there being one path that it is. And so when you say, like, I have to admit that there's constant change, it leads directly into a debate of what could the term change possibly mean, if not just what I am, my experiences, my story, what I am, my nature. And if that's what change is, just what it feels like to be me, then the challenge is just describing what it feels like to be me in a way that I'm not generating or destroying things, because that would contradict the nature of what is. And so I could just say, like, sure, there's change. There's my experience of today, tomorrow, and yesterday. But yesterday is where yesterday is, today is where today is, tomorrow is where tomorrow is, and I experience it all together in the fullness of my life. And I don't think that one moment is more privileged than any other. I experience every moment and every possibility in its own right. And so, by definition, I'm talking to you today, so I'm in today having this conversation. But if I talk to you tomorrow, I'm also over in tomorrow having tomorrow's conversation with you. I'll experience it all. I hope that is somewhat of an answer. If someone says, like, you have to accept change, it's like, well, yeah, I'm accepting my direct experience, but I don't know if I would call it change.
So here's a critique from Aristotle. Aristotle would say, and just to make clear, I agree with this, but I want to hear what you say. Aristotle would say, Aristotle, have different kinds of change, and the reason that I've posited these different kinds of change are to account for comprehensively all the various kinds of change and motion that there can be, that we see in the world. And there are two particular types of change that apply to our dispute, and that is alteration and generation and corruption. So alteration is like how a leaf changes from green to yellow in the fall, and this is a change that has to do with the underlying substance remaining the same, i.e. there's still the same leaf there from the beginning of the change to the end. It just changes color. So that's merely an alteration, as opposed to generation and corruption, where, say, the leaf comes into being because there's a new tree and it's just shooting out leaves right now, or if we go a step further back, where the new tree comes to be from an acorn. And that's different, Aristotle claims. The generation of that being is different from the alteration. And the mistake of the monist is that he collapses generation and corruption into alteration. Because if everything is there all the time, and you grant some level of change, then you're going to deny that anything ever comes into being or passes away. But what that leaves you with is this mistake of saying that it's merely alteration.
Well, I mean, it's hard to know where to begin with the objections. There's a number of objections, but also there's some questions about what these terms mean and whether they're legitimate terms. Like when we say coming to be, it's like, okay, what are the mechanics of this term coming to be? Because for Aristotle, coming to be or to be changed, there's a certain process he has in mind of potentiality and actuality, and whether we're assigning him some elemental theory or prime material and forms or whatever, there's a whole process behind those terms, and if those terms fall apart, then Aristotle really doesn't get off the ground, and we can just, I don't want to say dismiss him, but yeah, dismiss him. If his general model can't have a coherent version of come to be, then he needs to improve his account of what coming to be involves, And maybe in adjusting his model of what he means by come to be, he's now like me and we don't have the problem anymore. But the other thing as well is Aristotle has this idea of, and I don't pretend to be like anywhere close to a well-read Aristotelian, I'm not, but he has an idea of essence and like essential attributes and accidental ones, right? And so there as well, like it's like alteration is unique, I guess, because it has a particular subject that's privileged, right? I would just need to explore the model more, because I just suspect that there are so many things I would find objectionable in the model that I don't think Aristotle gets off the ground. And, I already know that's the way I feel. And this idea of like one thing coming from something else just doesn't work, because his coming to be, he's literally thinking that he generated a new thing that was not. We can argue about whether a potential is an actual and whether that involves what is not, but I think there are many fatal problems with Aristotle's model of change, to the extent I understand it. I don't think that change, or this process of coming to be, is coherent as he describes it, and therefore I don't really feel that the debate should be at the tail end of it, where he says, okay, given this system of coming to be, and given this system of a privileged substance that can have essence and accidental attributes, and there's this distinction, and given this also Platonic method of having subjects and their relations to each other be in different places in terms of their existenceness or realness, like, now what do you deal with my conclusion? I wouldn't deal with the conclusion. I would just go back and say, no, what do you mean coming to be? Like, what does that entail? Because he's going to say something like, oh, well, we have something that's actual, like a seed. And the seed has a potential to be a tree. And so the seed will come to be the tree if it gets water and sunlight and whatever nutrition it needs. And then I say, well, where did the tree come from? Because at time 2, you're saying there's an actual tree. But an actual tree and a potential tree are two different things. Where was the tree in this story prior to, day 2 when the tree is there? Because the tree is not the seed. The tree is not the sunshine. The tree is not the water or the nutrient. The tree is not the potential tree. Day 2 is an actual tree, and it was not present. It was a literal is not. And Aristotle is trying to squeeze blood from a stone, because there's no blood in the stone. There is no tree in day 1, and therefore there cannot be a tree generated out of nothing. The tree is a literal is not, which is a contradiction. But I suspect that will bring up an argument, because it sounds like you would disagree with me strongly on these points. But I think that Aristotle tries to get something from that which lacks it, and in doing so has a presentist idea of change that involves what is not coming to be, and having nowhere to put what is that he now wishes to do away with. But that's a lengthy argument that I've had, usually with Thomists, really. But that's what I do. I just attack the initial understanding of a process of coming to be, and this structure of essence and accident, and then see if we can just break his model at that point. Because if we do, I don't need to deal with any of his subsequent conclusions. But in fairness, there are many Aristotelians, and I'm sure you have a strong response.
Well, I think the most important part of your description that you left out is that at D1 you don't have a tree, and D2 you do have a tree, and that's kind of the fact of the matter that the monist has to explain. And I don't think one needs to be a committed Aristotelian, nor get into the weeds of what alteration involves or generation involves. All one needs to do is to say, there are these two kinds of change that are different from each other. And how does the monist want to bite the bullet and say that cases of generation are just alteration? Or does he want to say something else? That's ultimately the pressure that Aristotle is pushing the monist to pick up. It's not to adopt necessarily Aristotle's own particular views about change. It's to acknowledge that there are these at least two different types of changes.
Yeah, but I just don't accept that there are two different types of changes, right? I don't accept that one thing becomes another thing that it is not. A thing is what it is, not what it is not. And so if I'm referring to a tree, I'm referring to its complete set of possibilities, the whole story, as day 1 to day 100, the whole thing. And yeah, I can highlight different parts of it, like, okay, day 1 it was a seed, and day 2 it was sprouting, and day 3 it was a big pine tree or something. But I don't think the seed ceased to exist and became something that it wasn't. The term tree, or the whole story, exists complete and whole. That's the only coherent way to posit it. And there is no alteration, except in this relative sense of comparing day 1 to day 2. But day 1 and day 2, indeed the whole story of the tree, exists just the same as in accordance with the nature of that root that it is. Namely, complete and whole, is perfectly complete. And so there is no generation in the Aristotelian sense. The whole story exists completely. And I think that's, well, I don't want to get into Zeno, but that's usually how I also interpret Zeno's, any supposed solution to Zeno, I think, ultimately becomes one where we admit that the story is whole, and then we're able to see how one thing can overtake another, because it's a complete, it's a complete story. But now I've gone off track, and I apologize. We should just talk about the tree. I just deny the alteration and generation destruction.
Yeah, I have to go in a few minutes, but...
well, thank you. I deeply enjoyed the comments you made, and thank you.
Well, I think what I would say is, I mean, this is unsatisfying, and despite Parmenides' use of the terms, the most unpersuasive part of the monist account. It's that it does not grant that there are these individual substances. So when we take these raw goods, for instance, and we send them to a factory in China, and then some plastic and metal monstrosity, whatever it is, comes out of that, we think something has been created. And likewise, when we plant a seed, we grant that there's a difference between a seed and the tree that the seed gives birth to, that it creates.
Well, yeah, okay.
I mean, it's precisely that difference, and that obvious difference that Aristotle wants to press, that there is a difference between that and me going outside and merely getting a tan. Yeah, I change, I get a tan. I'm no longer as pale as I was, but that is much different from something that is created, that is generated. That's the part that's unpersuasive, I think, to people hearing you, because you deny what seems to be a very obvious difference from experience.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose I can't convince everyone. I just don't believe that on the side of Aristotle it's been shown that there is this fundamental, irreconcilable distinction between a person getting a tan and plastic and metal being melted down in a factory and becoming something else. I believe these are equivalent sorts of change, if we're to call them change. And, if we send plastic and metal to China and they make us a new laptop or something, I view that story as complete and inviolate in its entirety. So on day 1, the plastic and metal goes off to China, and it remains at day 1 forever and eternally, because the time is complete in the fullness of being, and what is ungenerated and imperishable. And so just like day 2 is complete, day 3, day 4, day 5, all of it is just various different details of a completed story that we experience, and we're part of that story. And you getting a tan is honestly no different in my mind in terms of the mechanics of it all than the plastic and metal being melted down and reformed into a laptop. And this idea that the pale you prior to the tan is gone and has now become something else. No, the pale you stands in its own right forever before you went out and got the tan, because every single part of what is inviolate and ungenerated. So yeah, I don't know if you find it unconvincing. I should work on it and think more about how to present it. But this idea that one thing becomes another thing that it is not, and that what is will pass away and what is not will come to be, I think Aristotle's steeped in that, and that's just something that I find very unpersuasive. And even if I did like the sound of it, I just think the single story of a root still left, that it is, cuts us off from that. But I accept that there are many, many people who continue to disagree with me, so clearly I need to work on my rhetoric. Maybe I'll read Aristotle's rhetoric.
Maybe here's one that's a little more rhetorically persuasive, that on your view, you would have to grant that they are the same type of change, a pale man becoming tan and the pale man dying. And that comparison, I think you would have to say, well, they are the same type of change. And
yeah,
to most people, they're going to hear that and say, no, that's nonsense. There's a great, vast difference between those two states.
Well, I just think when we say the man, his death is going to be a sort of a limit or a boundary on what we mean by the man, right? Just like his birth is a boundary when he began, and his death will be the boundary when he ends. And so we're not really talking about what happens with his body after he died is not really in the discussion at that point. But to the extent that we then incorporate it into the discussion, I just view it the same way as tanning, really. But I think there's a moral dimension. Like, I'm not saying go and light the man on fire or anything. No, I believe in morality. Yeah, but it doesn't really come into Fragment 8, the moral angle. But yeah, I believe there's a good and evil. I'm not saying there is no significance to his death. I mean, parts of the story can be very significant from our perspective. And I don't necessarily want the guy to die rather than get a tan. I definitely don't mean that. But that's sort of the challenge with the Eleatics, right? We don't get a lot of moral insight.
Thanks, fun. I have to go, but thanks. It's been fun.
All right, thank you. Take care. All right, so where were we? We got oh man, it's I gotta go soon. We got further along though this time. We got to the third line. All right, let's try and get a little further. What have I got? I got about 20 minutes. Let's go. So a single story of a root still is left, that it is. On this root there are signs very numerous, that what is ungenerated and imperishable, whole, single-limbed, steadfast, and complete. All right, so just as I was saying, I was reading the signs, just like these necessary inferences we can follow to understand the nature of that one root, isness or being. And so what are these signs going to show us? Again, they're very numerous. So there's a lot of these signs or logical sort of necessary inferences we can follow from there just being one thing, one root that it is, or being, or the Melesian one. It's that A, it's ungenerated, B, imperishable, C, whole, D, single-limbed, where was I? A, B, C, D, E, steadfast, and F, complete. Now, I will point out the steadfast, what do we got here? Atremes. So that looks like it's going to be the same word that we discussed at the end of the poem. Let's see. Where was it? Steadfast heart of persuasive truth. And in the Greek, again, I'm terrible at Greek. Atremes. Yeah, it's the same word. Okay, so basically we have the same word borrowed from the beginning. It's like unshaken. If anyone wants to go and listen to that discussion, we discussed it in one of the earlier sections of this read through when we dealt with the proem. But it's just an interesting thing about some of the etymology behind that word, and maybe how not only it means it's unshaking or solid on its foundation, but also sort of it's not afraid of any change or anything like that. But anyway, so we had these whole bunch of necessary inferences or signs that we can follow. And so we go into, what was the first one she mentioned? Ungenerated. So here we have this famous line, nor was it once, nor will it be, since it is, now, altogether, one, continuous. For what coming to be of it will you seek? But I want to focus on this because this language, nor was it once, nor will it be, since it is, now, altogether. And you can see alternate translations in the nest there, but I highlight this because we see this exact sort of language in several different pre-Socratic works. So I have a copy of Heraclitus here, and we're going to look at the, I see it as fragment 30. I believe this text here, it's a Phoenix pre-Socratics. I have one for Heraclitus too. I believe they follow the Diels Crans or whatever it's called, DK. But fragment 30 is going to be, listen to this. So Parmenides first. Nor was it once, nor will it be, since it is, now, altogether, one continuous. And then Heraclitus. Well, it begins with a bit in brackets because they don't know the first word that started it, I guess. The ordered world, the same for all, no god or man made, but it always was, is, and will be, an ever-living fire, being kindled in measures and being put out in measures. We have Heraclitus here in the space, actually, and he did a space reading through the fragments. And in that one, I mentioned the comparison for the last line there, being kindled in measure and being put out in measures. I compared that to Anaximander, right? There's one main fragment from Anaximander where essentially the apeiron, this sort of primordial goop or source of existence, allows things to come forth, and then they must repay that sin of coming forth by going back to the apeiron in the same amount that they went forth. They have to pay back what they owe. And here in Heraclitus we have kindled in measures and being put out in measures. So it's interesting there. But with Parmenides we have this language from Heraclitus is, it always was, is, and will be. And for Parmenides it was, nor was it once, nor will it will be, since it is now altogether. And I'm not sure how much there... Obviously we talk about Heraclitus as a guy talking about flux, but if we go to Melissus, I have a copy of Melissus here, we're going to find this exact same thing again. Let me... it sucks. There's no good... Well, there are good books on Melissus, but there's no good, book that just presents his translation in whole, from start to finish. There's a penguin that does it, but... Hold on. I'm just trying to pull it up here somewhere. Where is it? I'm only doing this because Melissus is an Eleatic author, and he has this same phrase, but he is closer to Heraclitus. And it makes me wonder, just how, even though Parmenides has got a different wording here, how different are they? Fuck this. I got an electronic copy. I actually wound up making my own. I didn't translate it myself, but I pieced together a bunch of different fragments and put notes and stuff on it. Here we are. Here we go. And it has no beginning or end, but is infinite. For if it had come to be, it would have a beginning, for it would have begun coming to be at some time. And end, for it would have ended coming to be at some time. But since it neither began nor ended, it always was and will be. It has no beginning or end. For whatever is not entire cannot be always, but just as it is always, so too must it always be infinite magnitude. Point is, right at that line there where it says, since it neither began nor ended, it always was and always will be. It has no beginning or end. So we have that from Melissus. We have, nor was it once, nor will it be, since it is now altogether one continuous from Parmenides. Which, even though their language seems opposite, right? Because Melissus is saying it always was, always will be. It has no beginning or end. Parmenides is saying it wasn't once, nor will it be. But then he says, since it is now altogether. I think they're making the same point, just with different language, honestly. Maybe I'm a little dim, or or maybe I'm just trying to force two Eleatics together, or I have a particularly Melesian interpretation of Parmenides. But they seem to be saying the same thing with language that is almost in opposition. And again, Parmenides, but it always was, is, and will be an ever-living fire. So that sort of language or phrasing, it crops up. I'm sure there are other fragments as well. I already referenced the last part of that Heraclitus fragment with Anaximander, and indeed you can reference it with the proem in Parmenides, because justice is as well at the gates in Parmenides. But that language there in the fourth line or fifth line of Fragment 8 is pretty common. And even though Parmenides puts a different spin on it, when comparing it with Melissus and seeing that they're making the same sort of point, I almost feel like it's just his way of saying it, but it's really the same thing. And Ancient's not here anymore, but Ancient did mention that there are some things that maybe Parmenides didn't have the language to discuss, or at least the technical language or specific language was developed later. Maybe this is one of those places and why he's opted for a slightly different language. I don't know. But I take it to be, obviously, nor was it once, nor will it be, since it is now altogether. I take that as a direct result of it being ungenerated and imperishable. Because if it doesn't come to be, and if it doesn't pass away, then there's no sense that we would talk about it in the past tense, right? Because whatever there is still here. It's not in the past tense. And we wouldn't talk about it in the future tense of, well, it's not here yet. Because that's just relative to wherever we're standing. Of course it's here, because it's all here. It's complete. It is. So that's how I take that to be. And that's the exact same point I see in Melissus there. The one continuous. Again, if it's ungenerated and imperishable, and is sort of inseparable thing that can't be divided, then of course it must be one. And it must be continuous. Because there'd be no points of... there'd be no external thing cutting it apart or cutting it off from what is. But then usually what I think people highlight here as well is this next line here where it says, "For what coming to be of it will ye seek? In what way, whence did it grow? Neither from what is not shall I allow you to think, for it is not to be said or thought that it is not." So right there, I've seen it referenced as the earliest expression of you can't get something from nothing, basically. But whether it is genuinely the oldest expression of that, I don't know. But that's sometimes what I see it pointed out as. But he's making an important part here, right? And it's tying back to the beginning of Fragment 8, because the beginning of Fragment 8, as we heard, was a single story of a root still is left, that it is. Because the goddess basically striked out the second path as incoherent or contradictory. And so why are we unable to find a place for it to come to be? What's the opening line? "For what coming to be of it will you seek? In what way, whence did it grow?" So he's like, all right, if you want to say this thing is generated or perishable, tell me, what sort of coming to be of it will you seek? And I know Ancient's not here, and I'm sure he has very good arguments to the contrary, but that's sort of why I was attacking Aristotle on this idea of a something becoming something else or coming to be. It's like, okay, we'll describe the process. What's the line in Parmenides? "For what coming to be of it will you seek?" It's not enough just to say that something comes to be. We actually have to examine that. I shouldn't even mention Ancient, because I'm not going after him here. For what coming to be of it will you seek? We have to examine that coming to be. What does that process mean? And in what way, whence did it grow? How did a seed become a tree? We have to examine what is actually being said here. And again, why are we examining it? Why are we asking this question? Because there's only a single story of a root left, that it is. And so whatever answer we have for these questions, whatever meaning we are giving the term coming to be and grow, it has to comply with the nature of that it is. Isness or being. It can't contradict being, because there only is being. There only is what is. So any contradiction is just incoherent. There's no other, there's no second thing they can seek recourse to in order to bolster this talk of coming to be or growing. So the goddess is like, okay, what coming to be of it do you seek? Whence did it grow? What do these terms mean? And then we hear, Neither from what is not shall I allow you to say or think. For it is not to be said or thought that it is not. Again, reference directly to the beginning of Fragment 8. There's only one root left, because to say that there is that which is not, in the sense that it isn't, there's no affirmative content there. There's no meaning. There's no such other route. So if the person will talk of coming to be or growth, remember again that discussion, I've had it so many times regarding Aristotle and other thinkers that have this presentist form of change in mind. But where was the tree when there was only a seed? And the person is going to have to try to say that it is not. For if it is, then it already is there and doesn't come to be, right? Because, it's like a seed comes to be a tree. Well, if the tree is already there, the tree didn't come to be, it already was, right? So when the goddess says, what coming to be will you see? How did it grow? Explain this process. And the other person will say, well, there was the tree wasn't there, and then it grew. And the goddess is saying, neither from what is not shall I allow you to say or think, for it is not to be said or thought that it is not. That's why the earlier part of the poem, those earlier fragments, are so crucial in establishing that there is only one root left. Because if the person cannot say that the tree is not and now comes to be, they have to just say the tree is where it is. They need this eternalist form of time, where it's not once nor will it be, but it's all now, all together. Time is a complete, perfect, inviolate whole, and all possibility in all moments exist equally, side by side. And so a tree doesn't come to be, a seed doesn't grow into a tree, because there is a seed in its own right, in its own time, forever, and there is a tree in its own right, in its own place, forever, and they have a certain relationship between each other, but this talk of generation or perishing has been banished, because it is not to be said or thought that it is not. So we banished generation and destruction in this sense, and we just have everything standing and existing in its own right and relating to one another. We can say the seed is close to the tree, but they stand in their own right, inviolate, and one is not dependent on the other in any existential sense, just a relational sense. But again, I guess I'm not very convincing, but that's what I read into that poem. For all the people that tell me I'm wrong, I still read it into it. And another point that we do, this is where I mentioned earlier that I thought it was a little unwise for the goddess to hound the youth or the double-headed people who believe in coming to be and growth. I believe this argument is kind of a bridge too far and weakens the goddess's point. But I see it is an interesting argument, and it would, maybe it's a bridge too far for people who agree with her, but it's not a bridge too far for people that don't agree with her, and she has to go out and combat their idea. Because let's listen to this. What need could have impelled it to grow later or sooner if it began from nothing? So she's saying, okay, let's say something comes to be from nothing. So there's this sort of genuine Big Bang, I suppose, where there is a literal is not. You can already see why I think this is a stupid argument to make, but I guess, we're talking to someone who thinks that there was nothing, and again, it's a youth, it's a double-headed model who names two when they should name one. So they're saying there's nothing, and then there's a Big Bang and there's something, or God created existence and now there is something when there was nothing, right? She's saying, okay, so there was nothing in the first instance. What compelled it to grow, or impelled it to grow, later or sooner, if it began from nothing, right? Because inherent in a lot of these philosophies is this idea of causation. Now, for an Eleatic, I would say that Parmenides, the goddess, they're going to have many objections to causation, but their argument, if they travel over into a different philosophy, like they're talking to an Aristotelian or someone, this does have weight to that person that they're arguing with. Because they'll say something like, nothing happens without a reason. Like there's a particular reason. Like a Stoic thinks it in a very determinative, like if you're talking to a Stoic, they're going to say that reality is quite determinative, right? It's like a machine almost, like the ball rolls down the hill and hits the other ball, which then rolls, and it's like this chain of causation. And it's like, okay, well, in this chain of causation, or in this story of what happens, or the creation of reality, you're saying there's nothing, and then it grows or explodes into something. What was the cause of that? And I think that's a kind of a devastating argument against someone who believes very strongly in a certain model of causation, because they need a reason for nothing to become something. And if they didn't have something, they didn't have a reason, then it shouldn't have happened, right? So it's another way of cutting out people who would argue that something comes from nothing. Now, I'm not a fan of it, because if you already agree that there's only a single story of a root left, that it is, like if you're already there, we shouldn't be getting into this argument about something from nothing, because there should never have been a nothing in the first place. We've already established there's just a single story of a root. And that's what she says in the line prior, right? In what way, whence did it grow? Neither from what is not shall I allow you to say or think, for it is not to be said or thought that it is not. We've already gotten it. So if you're already on the same page as a goddess, this is an unwise argument to even put forward. But if again you're continuing to argue with people who believe in some sort of broad causation model that involves generation and destruction, then it's a good argument. It's like, okay, something came from nothing, but when there was just nothing, what was the reason for something? I'm like, I can't have a reason because I just had nothing. And so the goddess then says that last line, thus it must either be completely or not at all. Because again, if you just have nothing, what's the reason for there to be something? There is no reason, because, we just said there was nothing. Which again is a contradiction, but let's entertain the people who believe in that sort of causation. They don't have a reason for something to come to be. Hear me? Someone give a thumbs up if you can. My app crashed and dropped me out. All right. Well, I'll end it there. We actually got through the whole page, so that's good. I hope you guys were able to hear the last part of that. Maybe you couldn't. I don't know. But I have to go and pick up my kids. And I got a thumbs up from. Okay, great. So you guys can hear me. All right, that's good. But I'm still gonna end it because this is like right at the end there, and I think I said my piece on this something from nothing sort of stuff. So everyone, thank you for being here. I'm glad we got through the whole page. I was really worried we weren't going to do it, but we tore through the last half there. And I will continue Fragment 8 in other spaces. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Shit. We got 5 pages left of Fragment 8. So 5 more spaces, I guess. And this one topped out at, it's like 2.5 hours or something, or 2 hours, I guess. I don't know. Who knows? Anyway, lovely seeing everyone. I got to go. Have a great day. For those of you listening on YouTube, I'm adding this part here because, fortunately, part of the discussion at the end there got cut off. You'll notice there's maybe 10-15 seconds of silence. Not even that much, maybe 5 seconds of silence near the end. But actually, it was a longer period. The last line is, I think, what was covered in it, namely, thus it must either be completely or not at all. The point being. Yes, it's not going to be as good as it was in the moment, of course, but what cause do you have for it to begin later or sooner if it began from nothing, right? If you just have nothing, then you don't have a reason for it to start today or a reason to start tomorrow, any reason for it to even come to be if there's only nothing, like if we're going to entertain this idea of positing a nothing. Hence, you may just have not at all. Because if there's just nothing, there's no reason for it to come to be later or sooner, or really impel it to grow at all. So therefore, I suppose there shouldn't be anything. Or it should be completely, I guess, because there's the last line here. Thus, it must either be completely or not at all. And if it is completely, then of course it is the goddess's point. A single story of a root still is left that it is. And it is completely whole and inviolate. Or what do we have at the beginning of Fragment 8? Ungenerated, imperishable, whole, single-limbed, steadfast, and complete. This is the last line there, and sadly the app had a bit of a problem and it got cut out, but essentially just further on that point about causation, it either has to be completely or not at all, and if you don't have any reason because all you have is nothing, then not only why later or sooner, but why impel it to grow at all, I suppose. So you either have it wholesale, whack, it's complete, perfect, whole, just like the goddess is saying, or if you have your nothing, then I suppose it's just not going to be at all, is it? Because there's no reason, because there's just nothing. Although, for the reasons I gave in the recording, it seemed a little unwise to pursue them too far if we've already accepted that there is just a single story of a root that it is, because that's why the goddess said, it is not to be said or thought that it is not. And what follows from there seems to be gratuitous or really chasing down opponents rather than building from our own accepted ground. And maybe for the goddess it makes sense, and she's teaching the youth, of course, at the end of Fragment 8, she's telling him, like, I'm going to make sure that you can run circles around all the people back in the mortal realm when you return. So it makes sense that she goes further and continues to attack the advocates of nothing or causation or becoming by saying, okay, if you have nothing, then this is the result. But from my perspective, of course, not being a god or goddess and not educating a youth to fight with people who believe in causation, that last argument is kind of akin to wrestling with a pig, right? I'm just going to get covered in shit. Why am I talking about beginning from nothing when I've already eliminated discussion of nothing as contradictory gibberish? So rather than wrestle with a pig, had I written the poem, I wouldn't have done that, but it makes sense, though, in a certain context, and who am I to question the goddess, right?